picture a coin, not gold or silver, but iron, rusted and ancient, with a face so worn the features have vanished into smoothness. On one side, words in High Valyrian, Vala Morgules, all men must die. This is not currency. This is a key that opens doors across the world, a password that commands absolute obedience from anyone who recognizes it, a token of the deadliest organization ever to exist in the known world. The Faceless Men. Even the name sends whispers through the halls of power. Kings fear them. Lords bankrupt themselves trying to afford them. Entire bloodlines have ended at their hands, yet few truly understand what they are, where they came from, or what drives them to serve the god of death with such unwavering devotion. This is a story of slaves who became the world's most feared assassins, of mercy twisted into murder, of faces stolen and identities erased. Let us begin at the beginning, which is not Braavos and not the House of Black and White, but somewhere far older, far darker, and far underground. Long before the doom reshaped the peninsula into shattered stone and poisoned sea, before the dragon lords raised their towers and bound their creatures to their will, before the Valyrian freehold grew into the greatest empire the world had ever seen, the foundations of that empire were built by hands that did not belong to the men who claimed the glory. Valyria was built on fire and on labor. Both were endless. Neither was chosen freely. The dragon lords of ancient Valyria discovered dragons in the volcanic mountains of their homeland, creatures of fire and instinct that they learned, through means still not fully understood, to bind. With dragons came power, with power came ambition, and with ambition came the need for workers, for diggers, for those who could descend into the mines beneath the 14 flames, and bring up what the earth held day after day, year after year, without rest and without reprieve. The slaves came from everywhere, from conquered peoples along the coasts of Essos, from villages raided in the night, from the trade routes that stretched across the continent. They were sorted by what they could endure, and those who were sent to the mines of Valyria were sent because they were considered disposable. The mines were not a place of labor in the way a field is a place of labor. They were a slow end. The heat below the 14 flames was extraordinary. The rock shifted and groaned. Men worked in conditions that shortened their lives by decades, and when they were no longer useful, they were replaced. There was no mercy in this system, no grace, no reprieve for those who wore out early, who broke under the weight of the stone, who died from the volcanic gases that crept through certain shafts without warning. Death in the mines of Valyria was not a distant possibility. It was a roommate. It shared your cot. It walked beside you down the tunnel. And it waited. And it was in this place, the most hopeless place that the ancient world had fashioned, that something began. The histories are not precise on when exactly or who exactly first gave voice to what would become the founding prayer of an entire order. The Faceless Men do not keep written records in the way that maesters do. Their lore passes through mouths, through ritual, through the long and grueling process of becoming no one. But what survives in the fragments of stories that have leaked into the wider world tells us this. Among the slaves in the mines, there was a man. Or perhaps it was many men, across many years, and the stories folded themselves together into one figure, as stories sometimes do. This figure saw what the mines were doing to those around him. He heard the prayers that the slaves offered, each in their own tongue, each to their own god, and he saw that none of those prayers were answered, not by the gods of the eastern shores, not by the old powers, not by the fire that the dragon lords commanded above, But death was answered. Death always came when called, eventually. And so this man, this first nameless figure at the beginning of what would become the Order, began to pray to death itself, not in fear, not in despair, but with the quiet focus of a man who has looked clearly at the only constant in an uncertain world and decided to address it honestly. He called it the many-faced God. He recognized it in every tradition he encountered, in every faith the other slaves carried with them. The stranger of the faith of the Seven, the black goat of Qohor. In certain Eastern faiths, he is likened to what some call the Lion of Night. Other lands give him other names, each carrying their own weight, each a different mask on the same silent presence. He saw that all of these pointed toward the same thing, that death was the one God all peoples shared, whether they named it or not, that beneath all the different words, the same patient darkness waited, and he decided to become its instrument. At first, the gift he offered was simple. When a slave in the mines was beyond all endurance, when the suffering had become a weight that no longer served any purpose, when a man or woman lay dying slowly in the dark, this figure would come to them. He would offer them something that their masters would not, a gentle death, a quick end, a mercy that the world around them had decided they did not deserve. He called it the gift. He did not charge for it. He did not ask permission. He simply listened to the ones who whispered prayers for release into the volcanic dark, and he answered those prayers himself, with his own hands, in the way that the God he served would have wanted. Quietly, with care, without cruelty. This was the seed. It seems like a humble beginning for an order whose name would eventually be spoken in a whisper all across the known world. But all deep roots start small, and in the minds of Valyria, this first figure was planting something that would outlast the entire empire he lived beneath. He would outlast the Dragon Lords. He would outlast the Freehold. He would outlast the Doom itself. The thing he planted would grow into a god. Or perhaps the god was already there, and he was simply the first to tend the garden. What makes a man into no one? It is not merely the erasure of a name. Names are shallow things, shed like old skin when circumstances demand. What the Order requires, what it has always required from its very beginning in the dark below the 14 flames, is something older and harder to put down. It requires the surrender of the self, the part that says, I want this and not that. I love this person and not another. I was born in this place, raised with these words, shaped by these wounds. The part that says, I. The man who became the first Faceless Man understood this early. After the mercy he offered, after those first quiet deaths in the tunnels below Valyria, he began to attract others. There were men and women among the slaves who had been watching, who had seen what he did and understood it, who felt the same pull toward the god of death that he had found, not because they were cruel, not because they took pleasure in ending lives, but because they had lived long enough in a place where death was ever present to stop fearing it, and in stopping their fear, they had begun to understand it differently. They came to him one by one, and he began to teach. The first thing he taught was stillness, how to quiet the self, how to sit with another person's suffering without flinching, without looking away, without the small, selfish impulse to step back when things became too difficult. This was harder than it sounds. The minds were full of suffering. It took discipline to approach it directly, again and again, without letting it harden you into something cold or break you into something useless. The second thing he taught was observation, how to watch a person and see beneath the surface of what they showed, how to read a body, how to understand what someone truly wanted, even when what they said and what they needed were not the same thing. The slaves of the mines had many faces. The mask they wore for the overseers, the mask they wore for each other, the face they kept inside, in the private dark of themselves. Learning to see past all three was the foundation of everything that would come later. The third thing, and this is where the order begins to take the shape we recognize, was identity. Specifically, how to set it aside. The first students of this nameless figure were asked to give up their names, not as a humiliation, not as a punishment, but as a practice, a daily exercise in understanding that the self is not fixed, that a man is not the sum of his name and his history, but rather something more fluid, more capable of change than the stories we tell about ourselves would suggest. They referred to themselves as no one. They referred to each other the same way. And in that steady, repeated practice, in the daily discipline of setting down the weight of a personal history, they found something unexpected. They found they could carry others' histories instead. This is not a metaphor. The ability to become someone else, to inhabit another person's way of moving, of speaking, of holding the shoulders, of looking out from behind the eyes. This was something the first Faceless Men discovered not through magic, but through practice, through the deep study of other human beings, through the surrender of the self, which created space for another self to be temporarily held. And then the magic came. Because there is magic in the world of the old gods and the new alike. There always has been. And beneath the 14 flames, in the volcanic dark, something older stirred in response to what the first Faceless Men were doing. The god they served was not a young god. Death is older than fire, older than dragons, older than the first men and the children of the forest combined. And when a group of people began to serve it with genuine devotion, not from fear, not to bargain, but with a practiced and sincere dedication, it responded, not in fire, not in vision, in a quieter way, in the way of something that has always been patient. The faces of the dead began to keep something of themselves, a face removed from a person who had just died and treated with the arts that the order developed, would, it is said, retain something of the person it had belonged to. Not the soul exactly. The Faceless Men do not speak of souls as other faiths do, but some echo of presence, some residue of who a person was. Those who have worn such faces and spoken of it afterward describe a warmth around certain ideas, a sense of familiarity that does not belong to them. A kitchen entered for the first time, and yet the hand moves toward the right shelf. A name heard, and the chest responding before the mind understands why. And in sleep, some novices report, the dreams of the one whose face they wore pressing in from the edges. This was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. It was, in its own way, the ultimate act of empathy. To carry another person's life against your own face. To look out from behind their eyes. And so the order grew. In the dark, beneath the empire that would one day burn, a tradition was taking root, a theology, a set of practices, a long and rigorous path toward becoming nothing in particular, and therefore capable of becoming anything at all. The slaves of the mines of Valyria were building something their masters would never understand, not because the dragon lords were unwise, but because what was being built below them required the one experience the lords of fire and blood had never had. It required knowing, in the bones, what it meant to be disposable, to be seen as less than fully human, to have your name taken from you, your choices taken, your future decided by the will of someone else. From that experience, from that particular and terrible education, the Faceless Men built an order dedicated to the proposition that death belongs to everyone, that the mercy of a quick and chosen end is not the privilege of the powerful alone, that the God beneath all gods plays no favorites. The dragon lords above never knew what was growing in the dark below them. By the time the doom came, it would not matter. The order would already be preparing to leave. The doom of Valyria did not arrive politely. It did not send word ahead. It came the way catastrophes always come, suddenly and from everywhere at once. The precise cause of what happened to Valyria on that day remains one of the great unanswered questions of recorded history. The dragon lords who might have explained it did not survive to do so. The accounts that exist come from survivors at a distance, from the sailors who saw the sky change color from far at sea, from the people of other lands who felt the earth shake beneath their feet and watched the horizon glow for weeks afterward. What is agreed upon is the shape of what happened. The 14 flames erupted, all of them, together or close enough that the distinction hardly matters. The greatest civilization the world had known at that point ceased to exist in what must have felt like the space between one breath and the next. Some traditions hold that the Faceless Men had already sensed what was coming. How they knew, if they knew, is a question the Order has never answered. One telling says it was the craft of their God, who stands at every ending and sees them from the inside. Another holds that people who had spent generations living beneath the 14 flames simply learned to read the earth better than anyone, and the earth had been speaking in a voice that grew louder with each passing year. What is recorded in the histories of Braavos and in fragments of other sources is that the slaves of the mines were already moving before the end came. 100 ships, the number repeated in the legends, though whether it was precisely 100 is perhaps less important than what the number suggests. Organized, deliberate, planned in advance. This was not a desperate flight. This was a departure that had been arranged. Those ships carried more than bodies. They carried the tradition that had been built over generations in the dark. They carried the founding theology of the many-faced God. They carried the first faces. They carried the long, slow process of turning a mercy offered to dying men into something with the potential to outlast empires. The ships sailed west. Westward because that was away from the ruin behind them. Westward because the order that guided the voyage had a sense, however imprecise, of where they were going. Into the narrow sea, into waters that the dragon lords had never considered worthy of serious attention because they lacked the dramatic qualities that the freehold found compelling. No vast plains of conquest, no ancient cities ripe for domination, just water and fog and small things clinging to the edges of the world. The exact location where those ships eventually came to rest was not chosen randomly. The great lagoon they found, the one that would eventually become Braavos, the secret city, the city that hid itself from Valyrian eyes for over a century, was chosen for specific reasons. Its geography made it difficult to see from the sea. The channels that led into it were treacherous without knowledge. It was, in short, a place that rewarded those who knew it and punished those who did not. The people who founded Braavos had spent their entire lives learning to be invisible. They understood the value of being overlooked. They built a city that practiced what they knew, hidden, quiet, unremarkable from a distance, and something else entirely once you were inside. And within that city, the order that had begun in the mines found a home. The House of Black and White was not the first thing built in Braavos. The city had to establish itself first, had to organize the chaos of 100 ships and however many thousands of people into something that could sustain itself. The great lagoon was settled over time, the channels marked and named, the stilted buildings rising slowly from the water as timber and stone were brought in from the surrounding mainland. The Sea Lord's palace took shape. The arsenal, where ships were built and repaired, became the great industrial heartbeat of the city. The Iron Bank, that institution which would eventually achieve a kind of power all its own, began as a simple treasury and grew into something that kings came to fear. But through all of that founding and building and organizing, the order kept itself separate. Not hostile to the city, they were part of it. They had sailed on those 100 ships like everyone else, but they maintained their distinct practice, their distinct way of life. Their God, who was the same God as all the others, only acknowledged more directly. When the House of Black and White was finally built, it was built to last. Not merely physically, though the building has endured. It was built as a statement of permanence, as an answer to the question of what happens to a tradition when it loses everything around it, when the civilization in which it was embedded is burned away. The answer the order gave was, it continues, it finds new ground. It builds something modest and quiet and harder to destroy than palaces and towers, because what it is built from is not stone. It is built from devotion, and devotion is difficult to burn. Braavos kept its secrets for a long time, a century and more after the founding, when the city finally revealed itself to the wider world. When the Sea Lord sent word to the remaining Valyrian successor states that Braavos existed, that these were freed slaves who had built something worth knowing about, that the secret city was secret no longer, the world was invited to look more closely. Not everyone who looked was comfortable with what they saw, but by then, the House of Black and White had been standing long enough that its roots went deep. The order had already extended its reach, had already begun to accept contracts from the wider world, not merely offering mercy to those who sought release, but offering the God's gift to those who were named by others, had already begun to build the reputation that would cause the most powerful people in the world to lower their voices when they spoke of the men behind that two-tone door. The journey from the mines of Valyria to the lagoon of Braavos had been long, but the god of death is patient. He had time. There's a coin that passes between certain hands in certain corners of the world, and it is unlike any other coin in circulation. It is dark, almost black, though it is iron rather than ebony, worn smooth by the passage of many years and many palms. No mint mark, no face of a king stamped into its surface, no number indicating its value in trade. It is, by the standards of any ordinary market, worthless. A coin with no name, from no treasury, worth nothing to a merchant who does not know what it is. But those who do know, those who have spent time near the channels of Braavos, who have met the right people in the right kinds of darkness, know that this coin is worth exactly one life. Not in the way that coins are used to purchase things. More precisely than that, it is a key, a signal, a handshake between two parties who have never met and will never meet again in the same form. When the coin is presented to a Braavosi who recognizes it, the correct response is a phrase. Two phrases paired like two halves of a door. Vala Morgulis, all men must die. Vala Doheris, all men must serve. These words did not originate as pleasantries, though they have become something like pleasantries in Braavos. Said between acquaintances the way other people might say farewell, or safe travels, or may the gods watch over you. In Braavos they say, remember that you will die, and remember that before you do, you will serve something. Whether these words are spoken lightly or with their full weight depends entirely on who is saying them and why. The Faceless Men taught the world these phrases. They carry the Order's core theology compressed into 6 words total. 3 and 3. All men must die. This is the truth they built their entire tradition on. The recognition that no exception exists, that no power is sufficient to outlast the God they serve, that the equalizing force of death is not a tragedy, but a fact. And all men must serve. This is the other half, the part that does not get discussed as often. Service, in the Order's understanding, is not submission. It is not the service of a slave. They knew that kind of service intimately, in the mines below the 14 flames, and it is precisely what they were fleeing from. The service of Valar Dohaeris is something else. It is the acknowledgement that a life lived in isolation from everything outside the self is not a full life, that the self has meaning only in relation to something, to other people, to a God, to a purpose that outlasts the body. For the Faceless Men, that something is the many-faced God. Their service is to death itself, and in that service they find the only kind of freedom that does not eventually betray you, because the God they serve is the one master who asks nothing you are not already going to give. The iron coin carries this theology in its silence. It has no face on it because the Faceless Men have no face. It has no value in ordinary currency because the Order does not traffic in ordinary value. It represents a relationship between the person holding it and the Order whose work it opens the door to. And that relationship is governed by the same principles the Order has always held. A coin was given, in the tradition the Order maintains, to those who had done something of note in relation to the Order's work, not as payment, not as a reward, as a recognition, a way of saying, you have touched something real in what we do, and if the time comes that you need what we offer, this will tell the right people that you are not a stranger to it. The coin Arya Stark carried had been placed in her hand by a man that called himself Jaqen H'ghar. She found him imprisoned in a cage on a road heading toward a war. She helped him survive something that might otherwise have killed him. He repaid that debt in a specific and peculiar way, not with ordinary thanks, but with deaths, 3 of them, of her choosing. This is worth dwelling on, because it reveals something about how the Order moves in the world. The giving of 3 deaths is not standard Faceless Men practice. Contracts come through the House of Black and White, through the correct channels, with the correct payment. A servant operating in the field does not generally offer the God's gift as personal currency. And yet, Jaqen did exactly this. Bound himself to a child's choices 3 times in the ruins of a burning castle, at a pivotal moment in a war that the Order had no obvious stake in. The 3 deaths Arya chose were not random. They were names from a list she had been building since before she understood what a list like that meant. The first was Chiswick, a soldier whose cruelty she had witnessed. The second was Wheeze, an overseer who had made her life at Harrenhal smaller and more dangerous. The third was Jaqen himself, which she then exchanged for something more useful. She used the 3rd death not as a death, but as leverage. She bargained with it. She traded the coin of a life for freedom, her own and that of the other prisoners. Jaqen honored this. He changed his face in front of her and walked away into a world where he no longer existed in the form she had known him. And before he left, he gave her the iron coin. There is something deliberate in all of this that the surface story does not fully explain. A faceless man operating in the field, offering deaths as personal favors, bound by a child's choices, changing his face and vanishing when the arrangement concluded. This is not the behavior of someone passing through incidentally. It is the behavior of someone on an assignment. The question of what that assignment was, and who sent him, and what connection it bore to the war around them and the child he encountered within it, is one the Order does not answer publicly. But the coin passed from his hand to hers, and from that moment something was set in motion that would eventually bring her to the door of the House of Black and White. Whether this was the intention from the beginning, or simply the nature of the coin finding its way to where it was always going to end up, is perhaps the kind of question the many-faced God finds amusing. Valor morgulis. All men must die. The coin knows this. The people who carry it know this. What they do with the knowing, that is where the story begins. There is a certain kind of building that does not announce itself. It does not reach for the sky the way the Titan of Braavos does, that massive statue that strides the harbour entrance and makes ships feel small. It does not gleam like the pink pavilion, or bustle like the markets along the canals. It sits where it has always sat, somewhere in the city's watery heart, near the holy refuge, some say, though the Order does not advertise its address, and it waits. 2 trees flank the entrance, one dark, one pale. A door that is both colours at once, split down the middle, as though whoever built it could not choose between shadow and light, or perhaps chose both deliberately. The building that houses the many-faced God is not a temple in the way most faiths would recognize. It does not have a great central nave with worshippers gathered in rows. It does not have a choir or bells or a priest elevated above a congregation. What it has is something more difficult to describe, a quality of accumulated presence, a sense, when you step inside, that many people have stood here before you in varying states of grief, and that the walls have absorbed some of it. The central hall is large and dimly lit. The pool at its center is dark. The water in it is not decorative. The pool has a purpose, and those who drink from it do not wake the same as they fell asleep. Around the hall, on pillars and alcoves, the faces are kept. This is not a metaphor. The Order does in fact store the faces of the dead within the temple. Men and women who died in the house, who chose to end their lives in this place, who gave the last thing they owned, the shape of who they were, to the God they came to serve. The faces remain. They are maintained by the Order, treated with the substances and the care that keep them viable, and they hang in their niches like the world's most solemn archive. Beyond the central hall, the building extends further than the exterior might suggest. There are corridors, rooms, the places where those who serve the Order sleep, if sleep is something they still do in the ordinary way. The places where the novices are trained, the kitchens where the meals are prepared, and where other substances are prepared as well, because the Order's arts include a long and intricate knowledge of what plants and compounds can do to a human body, which ones induce sleep and which dreams, which ones restore and which ones end. There are also the pools, the ones lower in the building, where the water flows from sources that are not entirely explained, where those who come to the house seeking the gift of death are brought and tended, and in the end given what they came for. These spaces are not gruesome. If anything, those who have glimpsed them describe a strange tranquility, the sense of a place designed entirely around the proposition that death does not have to be terrible, that it can be gentle, that it can be chosen. The Order that tends all of this has a hierarchy of a kind, but it is not the kind that announces itself with titles or chains of office. Rank here is expressed through function and trust, not through any document or formal designation. The people within the house take on the roles the house requires. Some tend the dying. Some train the living. Some are never seen in the building at all, operating elsewhere in the world in faces no one would connect to the order. The structure is real but deliberately opaque, and it suits the order's purposes for it to remain that way. The rule of the house is simple to state and almost impossible to practice. A servant of the many-faced God has no name, no family, no preferences that override the will of the God. The gift, the death that they offer, belongs to the God, not to the giver. A servant cannot choose on their own initiative who receives it. That is the contract. The order accepts contracts from those outside its walls. Yes, they take payment, always fair, always calibrated to the means of the one who asks, because the God plays no favorites, and the order tries to reflect that. But the final decision about whether a given death is the God's will, or merely a man's desire, is one that only the order makes. This is why the Faceless Men are not merely assassins. Any blade for hire can kill. What distinguishes the order is the theology behind the killing. The belief that each death they deliver is an act of service to something larger than the contract, larger than the coin, larger than the political maneuvering of the person who sent the request. Each death, in their understanding, is a prayer answered, the God's will expressed through a human hand. Whether the God of death actually wills each specific killing in the way the order claims, the order does not debate publicly. It is a matter of faith. And faith, in the house of black and white, is not a casual thing. It is not the faith of a man who goes to a sept once a week and considers himself devout. It is the faith of people who have organized their entire existence around a single proposition, and who renew that proposition every day by doing the hardest thing a person can do, giving up who they were. The house has stood through the fall of kingdoms, the rise of new powers, the shifting of the world's attention from one continent to another. It stood when Braavos declared itself openly. It stood through the wars that remade the shape of power in the free cities. It stood through everything, quiet and steady, the candle inside always burning. It will probably still be standing when the next great thing falls. To understand why, it helps to look at the relationship between the house and the city that surrounds it. Because the two are not merely neighbors. They are, in a way that becomes clearer the longer you look, made from the same idea. Braavos was a city built by people who had survived by being invisible. The 100 ships that fled the 14 flames did not sail toward glory. They sailed away from captivity into waters that the Valyrian dragon lords had dismissed as unimportant. They built something in the fog and the channels and the lagoon that the mightiest empire of the age never saw coming, because they had learned, from long and painful practice, that the best kind of survival is the kind that does not announce itself. The Faceless Men were among those founders. Their particular art, the erasure of self, the wearing of other faces, the practice of being no one in particular, is not incidental to the city's character. It is the city's character, distilled. Braavos kept it secret for over a century, an entire civilization, hidden from the power that had once owned its people. Ships passing near the lagoon entrance would see only fog and water and the suggestion of channels that went nowhere useful. The secret was held not through walls and armies, but through discipline and silence, through the practice of not being seen. The Sea Lord of Braavos and the order that operates within his city have never been formally intertwined. The Faceless Men do not serve the Sea Lord, and the Sea Lord does not command the order. but they understand each other. They were built by the same hands, from the same founding logic. A city that survived by hiding, and an order that survives by wearing other faces. These are the same impulse expressed in two different forms. The Iron Bank rose from the same foundations and embodies a different aspect of the same wisdom. The bank does not hide exactly. By the time of its great power, it has no need to, but it practices a kind of patience that mirrors the order's theology. It thinks across generations. It takes the long view on debts, on alliances, on the reliability of political arrangements. The Faceless Men think across the same span of time, but about something the bank does not deal in directly, the inevitability of ending. Braavos, taken as a whole, is a city that was born from the understanding that the powerful can be outlasted, that you do not need to match them on their own ground. You need only survive them. The Faceless Men are the sharpest expression of this understanding, the point of the blade that the city as a whole represents. But the blade does not exist without the city, and the city was always going to produce something like the blade. They are, in the deepest sense, one thing. Walk through the door of the House of Black and White, and two people are likely to be among the first you encounter. The first presents as an old man, kindly in bearing, unhurried, the sort of face that invites confidence rather than caution. He speaks gently. He listens well. He does not press. He offers water sometimes. He asks why you have come, and the asking carries with it none of the judgment that question usually implies. He is, in the manner that matters most to the order, exactly no one. But he wears the face of patience with such completeness that it has become, for many who visit the house, the face they associate with the order itself. The second is a young woman, or appears to be. She moves through the house with the efficiency of someone who has lived there long enough that its corridors are as familiar to her as her own hands. She is not warm in the way the old man is warm. She is something closer to precise. Her attention, when it falls on you, is not unkind, but it is complete. The kind of look that takes in rather more than you intended to show. These two figures, the kindly man and the waif, as those who have passed through the house tend to describe them, represent something important about how the order conducts itself internally. The order has no formal titles in the way that a citadel chain denotes rank, or the way that a lord's household has positions with names and defined responsibilities carved into custom. There are roles, priests, servants, novices, those who operate in the wider world. But the hierarchy governing them is not written down in a ledger that any outsider has read. What is visible from the outside is something more like function. The people within the house take on the roles that the house requires, and the roles shape them as much as they shape the roles. The kindly man's function is one of the most delicate in the order. He is the first point of contact for almost everyone who enters. The grieving who have come seeking their own end, the desperate who have come with a name and a purse, the rare few who have come with nothing but the intention of giving everything. He must be able to read all three kinds quickly and with accuracy, must know within the span of a short conversation which kind of visitor has arrived and what the correct response is, must offer comfort to one kind, evaluation to another, and a very specific form of testing to the third, without ever making any of the three feel they have been assessed rather than received. This requires a degree of perceptive skill that goes well beyond ordinary social ease. The kindly man sees through the performance people give when they are afraid, or grief-stricken, or desperate, or lying. He does not announce this. He simply knows and acts on the knowing, and the visitor rarely realizes how thoroughly they have been understood until much later, if at all. The waif's function is different. Where the kindly man works at the threshold, the waif works deeper in the process. She is involved in the training of those who come to learn. Her manner with novices is not unkind, but it is not soft either. She does not cushion the harder lessons. She does not pretend that what the order asks for is less than it is. There is a quality of honesty in her approach, a refusal to allow a student to hold comfortable illusions about what they are doing and what it will cost, that serves the training better than gentleness would. She has the look of someone who went through that training herself and came out the other side of it without nostalgia. Not because the process broke something in her, but because what she gave up completely, and she has made her peace with the giving. She represents what the training produces when it works the way the order intends. A person who no longer carries the weight of a particular history, who moves through the world with the lightness that comes from having truly set down a heavy thing. Together, these two figures embody the dual nature of everything the house does. The kindly man offers mercy, the soft entry, the gentle reception, the face that the many-faced God wears when he comes for those who are ready. The waif offers precision, the harder edge, the test, the standard that must be met before the order trusts you with anything it values. Neither is more important than the other. The house requires both. What is worth noting is that these roles are not permanent in the ordinary sense. The order's members do not hold positions the way lords hold titles. The person who presents as the kindly man today may wear a different face tomorrow, in a different city, on a different assignment. The waif is not a single person, but a function, a way of being in the house that is inhabited by whoever is best suited to inhabit it at a given time. The names are descriptions of roles, not identities. This too reflects the order's core understanding. A person is not their role. A role is not a person. What the house needs is the function, not the face, and the function can be worn and set aside the same way any other face can. The result is an institution that does not depend on any single member, that cannot be decapitated by the removal of one person at the top, that distributes its continuity through the practice itself, rather than through any chain of specific individuals. Empires are brought down by the deaths of their leaders. The House of Black and White was built, from its founding logic, from the very nature of what it teaches, to be far more difficult to destroy that way. No one person sustains it. The God sustains it, in the order's understanding. And what is sustained by something that does not die is much harder to end than what is sustained by the living. The door opens to everyone. That is the first thing that surprises those who know of the order only by reputation. They expect iron locks and guardians and tests at the threshold. What they find instead is a door that is neither fully black nor fully white, and a kindly old man inside who does not immediately refuse them. This is deliberate. The order has no interest in turning away the desperate or the grieving. Those are precisely the people the God serves. The question is never who may enter. The question is what they have come for, and whether what they want can be given, and what it will cost them. For most who arrive, the cost is money. They want a contract, someone's death, and they will pay for it. The order evaluates these requests on terms that are not entirely transactional. They consider whether the death is one the God would choose. This sounds like the kind of spiritual claim that could be used to justify anything, but in practice, the order has limits. They do not sell death to the highest bidder indiscriminately. There are deaths they refuse. There are contracts they decline. The reasoning is kept within the order. but the pattern that emerges over centuries suggests a principle. The God's gift is not a weapon for the powerful to use against the weak without consequence. For a very few, the cost is themselves. These are the people who come to the House of Black and White not with a name to offer, but with their own name to surrender. The ones who want to become a servant of the many-faced God, who want to walk the long, difficult road toward becoming no one. The Order accepts these people carefully. Not everyone who wants to join is suited for the process. Not everyone who is suited survives it. The training begins with what seems like the simplest possible instruction: stop lying, which turns out to be extraordinarily difficult because a person's identity is built, in significant part, from the stories they tell, to others and to themselves. The daily practice of telling the truth requires a novice to examine every small habit of self-presentation, every slight exaggeration, every deflection, every kindly half-truth offered to smooth a social interaction. The Order strips all of that away, not cruelly, but completely. Then comes the opposite instruction: become a liar, a specific kind of liar, not one who deceives to protect himself, but one who can wear any story convincingly, completely, without a single thread of his original self poking through. The novice is given characters to inhabit, simple ones at first: a market vendor, a dock worker, a pilgrim. They must spend time being these people, not performing them, but being them, so thoroughly that if a stranger spoke to them on the street, nothing about the interaction would ring false. This is extraordinarily difficult when you have a self, when you have a history, preferences, mannerisms, an accent, a way of holding the shoulders that says something specific about who raised you. All of that must be identified, catalogued, and set aside on command, not destroyed. The Order does not require its members to forget who they were exactly, but controlled, accessible, or inaccessible at will. The way a skilled musician can choose to play one instrument or another without forgetting the first. The years pass slowly in the House of Black and White. Novices serve. They clean the floors. They tend the pools. They sit with those who have come to die and offer them the comfort of a presence that does not flinch. They carry out the small, necessary tasks of maintaining a building and a practice. They study. The Order has accumulated a great deal of knowledge about poisons, about human anatomy, about the particular art of not being noticed in a crowd, about the way people in different cities and cultures hold themselves and speak, and what tells are produced by someone who learned their habits somewhere other than where they currently stand. They also learn to be blind. The loss of sight is not metaphorical in the early stages. There is a period in the training, a period whose duration varies by the student, in which the novice is given water from the pool that takes their sight. They live without sight for that time. They navigate the house, and sometimes the city, by other means. They learn what the world sounds like, smells like, feels like under the hands. They learn how much they had relied on their eyes, and how many of the assumptions those eyes fed them were shortcuts that a deeper attention can replace. When the sight returns, it is said to return differently. The world, after that particular education, is never quite as flat or as simple as it was before. The final steps of the training involve the faces, using them for the first time, experiencing what happens when a piece of another person's history presses against your own face. This is not described in detail by those who have survived it and then left the Order. Such people are few and reluctant to speak. But what fragments exist suggest that it is profoundly disorienting, that the self, which has spent years learning to be quieter and more flexible, must still hold its ground against the tide of another person's memories pressing in from outside. That the discipline required is the most demanding the order teaches. Most who reach this stage are ready. The years of practice have prepared them, but some are lost here, not killed, simply subsumed. Unable to find their way back to the thread of themselves they had thought they set aside carefully. They become the face they were wearing permanently, and in doing so cease to serve the order because they are no longer capable of the fundamental skill, putting the face on and then taking it off again. To become no one is to always be able to come back from nowhere. That is the paradox at the center of the training. You must be willing to surrender yourself so completely that nothing remains. And yet you must retain enough of a self to return to when the work is done. Otherwise, you are not a servant of the many-faced God. You are merely another face on the wall. The act itself does not look like magic at first. There is no flash of fire, no spoken incantation, no dramatic transformation in the manner of the old stories. What there is quiet and specific. A ritual whose steps are precise and must be followed precisely, because the order learned long ago that imprecision in this work carries consequences that are not easily undone. A face, to be used, must first be prepared. This begins with the dead. The order keeps the faces of those who die within the house, who came seeking the gift and received it. But they are not merely removed and stored like objects on a shelf. There is a process. Substances are applied. Rituals are observed. The preparation takes time and care, and the knowledge of how to do it properly represents some of the order's most closely kept learning. Enough has filtered out into the wider world that it is known. Flesh from the dead, treated in specific ways, can be worn by the living. The exact substances, the poisons, the preparations, the sequence of their application, the order does not teach to anyone but its own. When a faceless man prepares to wear a face, the process involves their own blood. This is not incidental. Blood, in the traditions that surround the many-faced God, carries significance beyond its physical function. It is the individual. It is the self. When a servant of the order cuts their own face and allows that blood to meet the prepared face of the dead, they are committing themselves to the transformation in a specific way. They are saying, I recognize that I am the one responsible for this. The blood is a vow and a key at the same time. The face then settles against theirs. It fits, not in the way clothing fits, loosely and separately, but in the way that suggests the face knows where it belongs, or knows where it has been placed. The features shift. The height may change, or may not. The limits of what the transformation can accomplish are not entirely documented. The voice changes with the face. This is part of what makes the skill so complete. It is not merely a mask, because a mask cannot fool a person standing close, speaking to you, listening to the timbre of your words. The change is deeper than surface. And then, those who have worn such faces report something begins to seep through, not all at once, and not with the clarity of lived experience. It is described more like a layer of warmth around certain ideas, a sense of familiarity that does not belong to you. Standing in a street that should be unfamiliar and finding your feet already know which turning to take. Hearing a name and feeling something respond in the chest before the mind arrives. In sleep, the faces of people never met. The order's training is built, in part, around navigating this, around the discipline of feeling the pull of a borrowed life without being drawn beneath it. A servant of the many-faced God must hold two things simultaneously: the shape of the person they are wearing, which they inhabit as completely as possible, and the thread of themselves, which must remain accessible. If the first overwhelms the second, the servant is lost. If the second overwhelms the first, the deception fails. What the order calls the hardest moments are not the ones when a servant forgets who they are. The hardest moments are the ones when the servant, looking through borrowed eyes, begins to understand the borrowed life too well, begins to feel the echoes of love for people that the dead person loved, grief for things the dead person lost, the residual warmth of a good day, years past, that lives in the face the same way warmth lives in stone even after the fire is out. Feeling these things without becoming them. That is the discipline the faces demand. There are accounts, uncertain and fragmentary, of faceless men who wore a face too long, who came back from an assignment and discovered that the thread they thought they had kept was thinner than they realized, frayed by days or weeks of living as someone else. The order is said to have ways of addressing this, to help a returning servant find their way back to themselves. What those ways are is not recorded outside the house. The magic, in the end, is not something separate from the practice. It is not conjured. It does not arrive from outside. It is produced by the combination of the servant's discipline, the prepared face, the blood, and the devotion to the God whose domain is death. The many-faced God does not perform the trick, the servant does. But the God, in his patient way, created the conditions, created, or perhaps simply is, the space in which such a thing is possible at all. Death has always been the place where identity stops mattering. The faceless men have simply learned to stand in that space while still alive. A servant of the many-faced God does not always use a blade. In fact, the blade is something of a last resort. Not because the order dislikes blades, they are trained in their use and trained well, but because a blade leaves marks. It leaves a body that tells a clear story to anyone who looks at it carefully. The work the order does best is the kind that does not leave a story at all. A man who is found dead with no wound is a man whose death might be many things. Old age, perhaps, a weak heart, an illness that moved quickly and quietly, the kind of death that does not invite investigation, because it does not look like anything other than what death usually looks like. For this, the order developed arts that go far beyond anything found in a Citadel Meister's herbarium. The knowledge they accumulated over generations represents a deep and careful study of what can be done to a human body. Knowledge of plants whose effects take hours or days to manifest, so that the giver is long gone by the time the gift arrives. They know compounds that mimic illness with enough fidelity that healers examining the body will reach exactly the wrong conclusion. They know combinations that, taken separately, are entirely harmless, but together produce an end that looks like nothing more than a man who lay down in the night and did not rise. The water of the house's lower pool is perhaps the most discussed of these arts, though discussion is perhaps too generous a word for what filters out to the wider world. It is known, among those who know anything of the order, that water drawn from the pool in the House of Black and White is not ordinary water. What it does depends apparently on who drinks it and how much. In small amounts, it takes sight. In larger amounts, it works more fundamentally, loosening the grip of the self on the body, making a person more permeable, less fixed in place. Novices drink it as part of their training, and they wake from the darkness it brings changed in ways that are difficult to describe precisely. In its most complete form, the gift delivered through the pool is the most peaceful thing the order offers. Those who come to the house to die, who arrive at the door seeking the end of their suffering, are brought to those lower rooms to the dark water. They go willingly. The preparation is thorough enough, and the substance gentle enough, that what happens there is the death the Order has always promised. Quiet, chosen, and without cruelty. This is the stranger's kiss in its purest expression. The mercy that the first faceless man offered to the dying slaves of the 14 Flames, perfected across centuries into something almost sacramental. The Order's alchemical arts extend beyond the pool. They include what might be called the Guild's working tools, the substances used in the field when a contract must be completed and the methods must be clean. A gift delivered in food or drink, a gift delivered through the skin, on the rim of a cup or the binding of a book, a gift released into the air of a closed room. The art in this form requires knowledge not only of substances but of bodies, of which compounds affect different constitutions differently, of how age and health alter the way a body receives what is given to it, of timing. A servant working a contract in the field carries very little that would identify them. No face that could be connected to anything. No weapon that would stand out. What they carry is knowledge, and the specific preparations they have made for the specific task at hand. The preparation of these substances is considered part of the sacred work of the Order. It is done with the same care and ritual attention as the preparation of a face. The God's gift, however it is delivered, is treated as an act of devotion rather than merely a practical task. The servant preparing a compound for a contract serves the same God as the servant sitting with a dying pilgrim in the pool room below. The intention is the same. The end is the same. Only the form differs. There is a precision in this that is easy to overlook when the reputation of the Faceless Men is spoken of in terms of their most dramatic abilities. But precision in the arts of ending is what has kept the Order operating without interruption through centuries of wars and upheavals. An Order that left obvious traces would not survive long in a world full of people with reason to want it gone. An Order whose work is indistinguishable from natural death, from accident, from the ordinary movement of illness and age. That Order is much harder to find and harder to stop. The Order never advertises what it knows. The substances, the preparations, the specific knowledge accumulated over generations. These are kept within the house and transmitted only through the training, not written down in any form that has survived outside the Order's walls. They are the most carefully guarded inheritance the Faceless Men possess, because they are, in the most practical sense, the foundation of everything the Order does. The blade is for when there is no other way. The face is for when closeness is required. But the gift given quietly, without announcement, in the ordinary flow of a life that simply stops, that is the oldest form of the art, the one the Order returns to most often. The first Faceless Man did not use a blade in the mines below Valyria. He used whatever was at hand in the dark, and he used it with care, and the people he helped did not suffer. That was the promise he made. The Order has kept it ever since. Most faiths make an accommodation with death. They find a way to look at it that softens its edges, that places it within a larger story, where it is not the final word. The seven tell the faithful that the stranger carries them across a threshold to whatever waits beyond. The followers of Rulla speak of a war between fire and darkness, and frame death as a weapon in that war, rather than the end of the story. The old gods say nothing at all, but the weirwoods keep their vigil, and something in the root seems to listen. The many-faced god makes no such accommodation. In the theology of the Faceless Men, if theology is even the right word, which it perhaps is not, because the Order's understanding of the divine is less a system of belief than a direct confrontation with reality. Death is not softened. It is not placed within a comforting frame. It is accepted as the most fundamental truth of existence, and then something more is done with that acceptance than simply bearing it. The God of the Faceless Men is not a deity in the traditional sense, a being who exists somewhere apart from the world, who must be petitioned or appeased or worshipped in the hopes of influencing its behavior. The many-faced God is, as the Order understands it, death itself. Not a personification of death, but death as a presence. Death as the constant beneath all the variables. And because death exists in every culture and every faith, the many-faced God has many faces of his own. He is the stranger of the seven, the black goat of Qohor. In lands further east, other names are given to the same presence. Names the Order recognizes as masks on the same face, though the mapping grows less certain the further the tradition lies from what is well documented. A narrower claim, then, not that all faiths are identical, but that beneath all the other attributes they assign their divinities, mercy, judgment, love, power, wisdom. There is one attribute every faith must acknowledge eventually: ending. And that ending, which all gods must participate in whether they acknowledge it or not, belongs to the many-faced God alone. Practically, this means the servants of the Order consider themselves answerable to something that transcends any particular allegiance. Not to Braavos, though they live there. Not to any house or family or rival faith. They serve death, and death, as they understand it, belongs to everyone. This is why the gift was first offered freely in the mines of Valyria, not as a service to the powerful. The powerful had not asked and would not have approved, but as a direct service to the God, expressed through the act of ending unnecessary suffering. The logic is simple. If the God's gift is death, and if a man lies in agony without hope of recovery, then the giving of death in that moment is an act of devotion. The God is honored, the suffering is ended, the prayer is answered. From this logic, the Order builds its entire structure of what it will and will not do. The gift can be given as mercy. This has always been acceptable, and the House of Black and White still receives those who come seeking their own gentle end. The gift can be given as contract. When the Order determines that a requested death is one the God would choose, they will provide it, for a price that reflects the means of the one who asks. But the gift cannot be given as personal vengeance by a member of the Order, cannot be given to settle a servant's private account with the world. The moment a faceless man kills for himself, kills because he wants to, because someone wronged him, because he has an attachment to the outcome, he has broken the fundamental vow. He has taken a life in his own name rather than the God's. He has put on a face and declared himself someone rather than no one. The punishment for this is said to be the only punishment the Order gives its servants: death itself. Not as cruelty, as consistency. The gift that a servant gave without permission must be repaid. The life they took must be balanced. That is the theology made practical. Death belongs to the God, and what belongs to the God must be returned to the God. A certain quality runs through this theology that is difficult to name but unmistakably present. A kind of equality. Not the comfortable sort invoked when someone wishes to seem fair. Something older and less negotiable. The equality of the grave. Gold means nothing when the many-faced God arrives. Birth means nothing. The names spoken in reverence or fear across a reign of 30 years mean nothing. He comes to the same door for all of them. Contracts are priced accordingly. The powerful pay more, the desperate pay less. because death, as the Order understands, it was never meant to be reserved for those with the deepest purses. Feared the Order may be, but the fear carries, in some corners of the world, a strange undertone of something close to respect. They are killers, and no one pretends otherwise, but they kill in service of something genuinely beyond themselves, and in a world full of men who kill for gain, cruelty, or the pleasure of watching smaller things break, that distinction is not lost on everyone. They kill, as far as anyone can determine, because they believe it is what the God wants, and they have been believing it since long before any of the other powers of the world were old enough to have a history worth remembering. The world is full of people who traffic with forces beyond ordinary understanding. Fire priests who pull shadows from flame. Warlocks who drink blue smoke and see visions in still water. Shadowbinders from Ashai who coax dark shapes from the space between one heartbeat and the next. The men and women of the glass candles, whose lights are said to carry voices across oceans. Magic is not rare in the world of the Faceless Men. It is simply organized differently by different people. Understanding what makes the Order distinct from these other traditions requires looking honestly at where they touch and where they diverge. Because on the surface, there are similarities. The Red Priests of Valyria deal in death readily enough. They walk willingly through fire. They coax life back from the edge of ending. And their God is framed explicitly as existing in opposition to a death they call the Great Other. The Warlocks of Korth draw power from sources that are not fully explained, and they are not squeamish about how they use it. The Shadowbinders of Ashai work with forms of killing that are strange and specific and expensive in ways that are not purely financial. But the Faceless Men are not these things, and the differences matter. The Red Priests serve a god of fire and light. Their relationship with death is instrumental. Death is a tool in Roller's war, a weapon, an obstacle to be overcome, or a sacrifice to be made for a larger victory. When they kill in service of a narrative in which death is the enemy and fire is the answer. When they resurrect, as certain among them have been known to do, pulling the dead back from the wrong side of the threshold, they are working directly against the finality that the many-faced God holds as sacred. To the Faceless Men, resurrection is not a miracle. It is a refusal, a theft from the God, a debt that will be collected eventually with interest, because the God of death does not forgive debts. He only defers them. The Warlocks of Korth pursue knowledge and influence through means that require the shedding of ordinary perception. Their arts twist inward rather than outward. They make themselves strange so that the world becomes legible to them in ways it is not to others. There is a coldness to their practice, a detachment that superficially resembles the Faceless Men's erasure of self. But the Warlock's detachment is in service of the Warlock. The power accumulated flows back to the practitioner. The self that is distorted for its own enrichment, its own extension, its own perpetuation. This is the opposite of what the Order teaches. A faceless man who accumulated power for himself would have broken the most fundamental vow he made. The Shadowbinders are perhaps the closest comparison in terms of method. They work with things that cannot be easily explained, and they do work that results in death, and they require a price from themselves as well as from others. But their relationship with what they call forth is one of command. The shadows they shape are bound and directed. They maintain themselves as the authority over what they summon, the master above the servant. The many-faced God is not a force that the Faceless Men command. The relationship runs the other way entirely. The servant does not direct the God. The servant offers themselves, and the God works through them, and the distinction is not subtle. there is also the question of what each tradition's death means. For the Red Priests, a death in service of the Lord of Light is meaningful. It feeds the fire, it resists the darkness, it contributes to a cosmic struggle. For the Warlocks, death is more neutral. A side effect, a cost, a raw material. For the Shadowbinders, it is the price of the art. For the Faceless Men, every death is a prayer. Not because all deaths are joyful or desired, but because all deaths complete something. Every death returns something to the God that was always his. Every death is, in the Order's understanding, the fulfillment of a promise the universe made at the moment of birth, that this life would eventually end, and that ending would be received. This is why the Faceless Men do not fear death the way other traditions try to escape it, or harness it, or hold it at bay. They do not fear it because they have looked at it until the fear wore out. They have sat with the dying. They have prepared the faces of the dead. They have drunk the waters of the pool. They have worn the memories of the gone. They have made death as familiar as a hearthstone, and in that familiarity found something that none of the other traditions quite arrive at. Not peace exactly. Peace implies the absence of something difficult, and what the Order carries is not comfortable. Acceptance, perhaps. The clean and undiluted recognition that the many-faced God is not a threat to be countered, or a force to be mastered, or a price to be paid. He is simply what is. And being what is, he does not need you to like him. The Faceless Men, alone among the great magical traditions of the known world, have built an entire way of life on that recognition. They have not tried to escape it, overcome it, exploit it, or bargain with it. They have joined it. Whether this makes them the wisest tradition or simply the most ruthlessly honest one, the answer is probably both. The reputation of the Faceless Men is old enough and widespread enough that it has acquired a kind of power all its own. In the free cities, in Westeros, in the eastern ports along the summer sea, the name is spoken with a particular quality of silence around it. Not exactly fear, though fear is present, but the kind of careful attention that people give to things they cannot control. A hired blade from the Myronese fighting pits is dangerous. A faceless man is something different, and the distinction is understood even by people who have never personally encountered one, and are not entirely certain they would recognize one if they did. This is, of course, entirely intentional. No advertising has ever come from the House of Black and White. Its reputation was built slowly, over many centuries, through work completed with a thoroughness that left behind only results and no explanation. A man is alive one evening and not the next. The body, when found, shows no sign of violence, or shows signs pointing conclusively to someone who was elsewhere when the death occurred, or is not found at all. The absence of evidence is itself a kind of evidence to those who know how to read it. Cost is legendary for a reason. It is not merely high. Many skilled and specialized things cost much. What sets the Order's price apart is that it is calibrated, proportional. No flat rate, no standard fee. Those seeking a contract are assessed, their wealth, their means, the weight of what they are asking, and the price reflects that assessment. A death requested cheaply and easily is a death requested without proper weight. To want the god's gift delivered to someone else's door, you must feel the cost of the wanting. The list of contracts that can be attributed to the Faceless Men across history is uncertain, because attribution is difficult when the work is done well. Certain deaths, in certain political contexts, have the quality about them, the cleanness, the inexplicability, the sense of something accomplished with more precision than ordinary violence usually manages. Historians note these cases. They speculate. The order neither confirms nor denies. What is known, because the faceless men do not always hide everything, is that they have been active for a very long time. Active during the final centuries of the Valyrian freehold, active during the century of chaos that followed the Doom, when the free cities were jostling for position in the power vacuum, and men with sufficient coin and sufficient desperation had occasion to need what the order provided. Active during the rise of Braavos as a significant power, when the city's fortunes and the order's reputation were intertwined in ways that both parties understood, but neither discussed directly. There are certain principles that the order holds about which contracts it will accept, and some of these have filtered into common knowledge over time, or at least into common belief, which is not always the same thing. Some hold that the order refuses to target children. The texts that survive do not confirm this as a hard rule, and the order has never explained its limits in writing. What can be said is that there are deaths they refuse, and the reasoning stays within the walls of the house. The pattern that emerges over centuries suggests the god's gift is not entirely for sale to whoever offers the most coin. There are limits. Their precise shape is deliberately unknown. Beyond these limits, the order is flexible. They have served small clients and powerful ones. They have delivered the gift to kings and to servants of kings, to merchants and to rivals of merchants, to people who wronged other people, and to people who simply stood in someone else's way. The moral texture of their contract list, taken over centuries, would make for uncomfortable reading. But the order does not pretend to be a moral authority. It pretends only to be a servant of the God whose judgment it trusts more than its own. There is something almost merciful in this position, in its own dark way. The faceless men are not the only people in the world who kill for coin. They are simply the ones honest enough to organize the whole practice around a theology, rather than pretending it is something other than what it is. Consider what it means for a faceless man to be caught. Not caught in the sense of discovered and unmasked, though that would be remarkable in itself. Caught in the literal sense. Imprisoned, caged on a cart heading toward a war, locked up with common criminals, traveling through a land burning with conflict and short on patience. This is where Arya Stark first encountered the man who called himself Jaqen H'ghar, and the circumstances of that meeting deserve more examination than they usually receive. The name Jaqen H'ghar is a name. Not the man's name, the order does not have names, but a name, a face and a history he wore at that time, in that place, the name he gave when asked. It carries the sound of Lorath, that particular free city, and it is delivered with the casual confidence of someone who has inhabited it long enough that it fits without seams. He presents as a man of no great consequence. He is in a cage. He is being transported somewhere he did not choose. One reading of this is accident. A faceless man traveling under a borrowed identity, caught up in the ordinary chaos of a country sliding toward war. Another reading is more deliberate. A servant of the many-faced God does not typically end up in a cage by chance. They are trained, from their earliest days, in the specific art of not being noticed. An operative who is caged and transported may have chosen that particular form of travel, may have wanted to be on that road, heading toward that castle, in that season of that war. This is speculation. The order does not publish its intentions, but the rest of what followed at Harrenhal has the quality of something that was more planned than it appeared. What that assignment was, and who commissioned it, and what the Order hoped to accomplish at Harrenhal, these questions do not have clean answers written down anywhere. The Order does not publish its contract list, but certain things can be traced. Harrenhal at that time was occupied by Lannister forces. It was a place of significant strategic importance in the war reshaping Westeros. It was also a place where specific people were present. People with names that might, under certain circumstances, have been names on a contract list somewhere. The 3 deaths Jaqen offered Arya were unusual in their framing. He presented them as a debt. She had saved 3 lives from fire, meaning the god had been robbed of 3 deaths. To balance this, 3 deaths would be given. It is the theology of the Order expressed in almost perfect form. The god's account must balance. What was saved must be returned. The debt is not hers but the god's, and Jaqen is the instrument through which the god settles it. She chose her 3: Chiswick, Wheeze. Then, in the moment that defined her relationship with the Order for everything that followed, she named Jaqen himself. He went still. The story records this. A man who had shown no obvious fear of anything went still when a small girl named him to die. Not because he was afraid of death. A servant of the many-faced god is not afraid of death. That would be roughly equivalent to a fisherman being afraid of water. He went still because the move was unexpected, because she had found the leverage in the situation and used it precisely, because naming him forced the kind of negotiation that the Order's theology does not generally allow for: a bargain. Her choice of death for his freedom. He honored it. He helped free the prisoners she demanded. He changed his face in front of her. The only time in the entire account that the Order's most guarded ability is displayed openly to a child on a road in the middle of a war. This is significant. He could have refused or found another way to resolve the situation. He chose instead to demonstrate something, to show her what he was and what the Order could do in a way that would stay with her. And then he left her the coin. The giving of the coin, with the phrase and the instruction, was not an afterthought. It was a door left deliberately open. The Faceless Men do not hand out iron coins carelessly. The coin is a commitment, a recognition that carries weight, that means something specific when presented correctly. Giving it to a girl he had known for a few weeks, in the middle of a war, before vanishing into a changed face and a different life. This was a considered decision. The question of why the Order sent a servant to Harrenhal, and why that servant chose to leave a door open for a Stark girl who had shown more courage and intelligence than most adults he had likely encountered, remains one the Order has not answered publicly. But the door was left, and Arya eventually walked through it, and what followed was the longest and most revealing encounter between the Faceless Men and a single individual that the histories record. Jaqen H'ghar, whoever he was, whatever face he wore before that name and after it, was not merely a man in a cage on a road. He was a thread from a very old loom, and he wove himself into a story that was not finished when he walked away from it. The many-faced god's threads are like that. They are long, and they run in directions that are not always apparent until you have followed them to their end. She came to Braavos with a coin and a phrase. The coin was not ordinary currency. It was iron, dark, with no mint mark that any ordinary sailor or banker would recognize. The phrase, Vala Morgulis, all men must die, was the response expected when someone presented that coin to a Braavosi who understood what it meant. The correct response was Vala Doheris, all men must serve. These words are not merely pleasantries. They are a compressed theology, a statement about the nature of existence that the Order uses as a kind of handshake. All men die. All men serve. The serving comes first, and the death comes after, and between the two, there is whatever a life amounts to. The Faceless Men taught the world this phrase, though few who use it understand its origin or its full weight. The coin Arya Stark carried had been given to her by Jaqen H'ghar, a man she had met on the road during a war she was too young and too unprepared for, who had done things she had barely understood at the time but had not forgotten. He had told her, if she ever needed to find a faceless man, this was how. He had told her the phrase. He had, in his way, left a door open for her, and she had eventually walked through it. The circumstances of her arrival in Braavos matter. She had lost almost everything by the time she reached that city. Her father was dead, executed publicly in a way designed to be seen and remembered. Her family was scattered and diminished. Her home was occupied. She had been moving for years through a world that wanted to use her, hurt her, or bury her, and she had survived it by developing a particular relationship with the names of the people who had done these things. She kept a list. She rehearsed it. The names were, in some ways, the last things she had that were entirely her own. This is precisely what the Faceless Men would ask her to give up. She found the House of Black and White not immediately, and not easily, but she found it. The door opened for her. The kindly man inside did not turn her away, which tells us something about what he saw in her and what the Order recognized as potential. She was allowed to stay. She was allowed to begin. What followed was a long education in the principles we have already discussed. The surrender of self, the practice of truthfulness, the building of other identities. She was asked to set aside the name she had carried, the history she had carried, the grief she had carried. She was asked to say, when asked who she was, no one. She kept failing, not in small ways, in the specific, decisive way that someone fails when the thing they are being asked to give up is the only thing they have decided is worth keeping. She could not release the list. She could not stop being Arya Stark, not because she was unwilling to learn the skills the Order was teaching, but because Arya Stark was what she was trying to protect. Not herself exactly, the names, the debt she felt she owed to the dead. The Order saw this and chose to continue working with her regardless. This is itself significant. The Faceless Men do not carry students who cannot eventually commit. The fact that they kept her suggests they saw something real in her capacity, even tangled as it was with the attachments she refused to release. She was blinded. That period of sightlessness we discussed, she endured it, and more than endured it. She found, in the absence of sight, something sharpened. She returned from the blindness with abilities the training had built on, heightened attention, a finer instinct for reading people, a confidence in her capacity to navigate darkness that she had not possessed before. She was given contracts. Each one was a test with a second purpose hidden inside it. The first was to study a man in the city, to learn his patterns, his routes, the texture of his days, and then to judge whether what she had gathered was enough to act on. The Order was not only testing her ability to gather information, they were testing her ability to see a person clearly, to observe without projection, to understand someone well enough to know when to move and when to wait, without letting personal feeling blur the picture. She performed this work with a skill that the Order recognized, though recognition in the House of Black and White is expressed in continued trust rather than praise. The deeper test came not from the contract itself, but from what it required of her inwardly. Each assignment placed her in proximity to the ordinary life of the city, to people who had done nothing to wrong her, whose deaths were contracted by strangers for reasons she was not given. She had to hold her purpose clearly while moving through days that had nothing to do with her list, her grief, or any of the things that had shaped the girl who arrived on the dock with an iron coin in her hand. The Order was watching for the moment when the two versions of Arya Stark, the one who had come to serve the god and the one who still served the list, would collide. They were patient about it. They had always known both versions were present. This is not the behavior of no one. No one does not judge. No one does not adjust the assignment based on personal assessment. What Arya Stark did in that moment was act as a person with a self, someone who had learned the skills of the Faceless Men while remaining in the part that counted most, a Stark of Winterfell. The fallout was swift and serious. A faceless man's face was taken without permission, taken by someone who had not completed the training, had not earned the right, and whose action represented an unauthorized use of the Order's sacred tools. The debt created by that act required repayment in the Order's theology. The life she gave was not the god's to give through her. It was hers, and hers was therefore owed. The consequences came. The Order does not forgive this kind of transgression because its entire architecture rests on the principle that the gift belongs to the god and not the giver. What she had done was give the gift in her own name. She had taken a life as Arya Stark, and Arya Stark was not a servant of the many-faced god. She was a girl with a list and a need for justice that the Order has no category for. There is a question that the theology of the Faceless Men does not answer directly, because it is not a question the Order is particularly interested in. Can you go through the training? Can you spend years learning to be no one? Can you drink the blindness? Can you wear the faces of the dead and feel their memories press against your own? Can you become a genuine instrument of the many-faced God, and then choose, after all of it, to be someone again? The Order's answer, insofar as it has one, is the choice was made when you entered the door. The identity you gave up was the price of admission. It was not left in storage somewhere, waiting. It was offered to the god. You do not get it back. And yet, Arya Stark left Braavos. She left without the blessing of the Order. She left with a face she had used without permission. She left with the list still inside her. She left in a direction the Faceless Men did not choose for her. By every principle the Order holds, she had failed. She had proven that she could not become no one. She had taken and used the Order's arts without giving what the Order required in exchange. She had, in the most direct theological sense, stolen from the god. The person who walked back into the world was not no one, but she was also not quite the person who had left it. Something had changed in those years in Braavos, something real and not reversible. The girl who had arrived at the House of Black and White, carrying her grief like a drawn blade, had been changed by what she encountered there, not into a faceless man, into something that did not have a name in the Order's tradition, because the Order had not previously made a student of her particular kind. She had learned to see clearly. She had learned to move through a crowd without being noticed. She had learned to be still in the presence of suffering. She had learned what the Order taught about patience and observation, and the discipline of putting aside what you want in favor of what the work requires. She had learned these things while failing, persistently and stubbornly, to give up the self that those lessons were supposed to displace. The Faceless Men would say she took more than she gave. They would say the debt remains unpaid. Whether the god agrees is not recorded. What is clear is that Arya Stark returned to the world, having passed through a place that few people pass through and come back from. And what she brought back was not a set of magical abilities cleanly separated from everything else. It was something woven through her entirely, a particular quality of attention, a comfort with darkness and death that most people spend their entire lives building walls against, a capability for patience that was not natural to her before. She had learned the most dangerous thing the Order teaches, which is not how to wear a face. It is how to see past the face someone else is wearing. The Faceless Men, for their part, did not pursue her with the finality that their theology might seem to demand. The girl who was supposed to be no one slipped back into the world, and the Order did what the Order always does. It waited. Whether they consider the account settled or merely deferred is not something they have announced to the wider world. Perhaps they see the debt repaid in the deaths she delivered before she left. Deaths that were, in the Order's own estimation, acceptable acts of the God's will. Perhaps they consider her simply a failure of a particular kind, one that the training occasionally produces and that is not worth pursuing, because the God will collect from her eventually regardless. The many-faced God, after all, is patient. He has never failed to collect. But here is the deeper question that Arya's story raises, without fully answering it. What does it mean that a person can pass through the house of black and white, can absorb its teachings, can demonstrate genuine capacity for its disciplines, and still not become what the Order makes? The Order would say it means she failed. She lacked the final commitment. She could not release the last thing. A different reading might say she succeeded at something the Order had not intended to teach. That the Order, in trying to make her no one, instead showed her something about who she was that she had not previously understood. That Arya Stark is the kind of person who cannot let go of the ones she loved, and that this is not a weakness, but the deepest thing about her. That the Order stripped away everything else and left that standing, and that standing thing is what she brought back into the world. These two readings are not reconcilable. The Order is not interested in the second one, but history has a way of finding the reading that the people involved did not intend. Most powers in the world think in seasons, in the span of a reign, in the life of a treaty or a marriage alliance, or the time it takes for a conquered people to either accept their conquerors or find a way to throw them off. The Faceless Men think in centuries. This is not a rhetorical distinction. It describes something real about how the Order operates, how it makes decisions, and why it has persisted while empires and kingdoms and entire civilizations have risen and collapsed around it. The Order was founded in a civilization that no longer exists. It survived the single most catastrophic event in the recorded history of the world. It built itself a new home in a city that was secret for over 100 years. It has watched the free cities become what they are. It has watched Westeros change shape through conquest and war and the slow erosion of old traditions. It has watched the Iron Throne built, contested, inherited, and fought over through generation after generation of families who believed they had secured something lasting. None of these things surprised the Order, because the Order did not expect them to last. The theology of the many-faced God is, at its heart, a theology of impermanence. Every life ends. Every arrangement concludes. Every power that rises will eventually find its limit and be replaced by the next power, which will also find its limit. The Order holds this not as a prophecy about specific events, but as a description of the shape of things. The wheel turns. The tide comes and goes. The flame burns until it does not. Knowing this in a lived rather than merely intellectual way changes how you plan. An order that believes nothing lasts does not build its continuity in the way that institutions built on permanence do. Through the accumulation of property, through the establishment of bloodline succession, through the inscription of authority into stone and law. These things can be taken away. The Faceless Men build their continuity through the transmission of practice. The knowledge passes from those who have it to those who do not, through the long and grueling process of training that we have already discussed. The order cannot be destroyed by seizing its building, because the building is not where the order lives. It lives in the people, and the people do not stand still. It lives in the faces on the walls, and the faces are not merely symbolic. It lives in the relationship between the servants and the God they serve, which is a relationship that does not require physical infrastructure to function. A king who wants to destroy the Faceless Men cannot simply burn the house of black and white. The order would rebuild. It has, in its long history, operated in worse conditions than a rebuilt temple. What cannot be burned is the knowledge, and the knowledge is in people who look like no one in particular, scattered across the known world, indistinguishable from a Braavosi merchant or a Myrish trader, or a silent pilgrim passing through a city on the way to somewhere else. The order's patience extends to its contracts as well. There are accounts, unverified, but consistent in their shape, of contracts accepted by the Faceless Men that were not completed for years, decades in some cases. The order does not rush. If a target is unreachable today, they wait. If circumstances have not yet aligned in a way that allows the gift to be given cleanly, they maintain the arrangement and return to it when the moment is right. The God of Death is not in a hurry, and neither are his servants. This is difficult for clients to understand sometimes. A person who approaches the house in desperation wants the thing done quickly. They are in pain now, or threatened now, or burning with a need for resolution that does not understand delay. The order accepts their payment. The order makes no promises about timing. And the order completes the contract when the contract can be completed well, not before, and never in a way that compromises the cleanness of the work for the sake of speed. The long view also shapes how the order regards the individuals who pass through its walls. Arya Stark spent years in the house. Those years were not wasted from the order's perspective, even though she ultimately left without giving what the order required of her. The order invests in training because training is how continuity is maintained across generations. Not every investment produces the expected outcome. Some students fail. Some are lost to the faces they wear. Some, like Arya, find the edge of the threshold and refuse to cross it. These outcomes are absorbed. The order does not collapse because a student chose a different path. It simply continues, with the same patience, toward the same ends. The world outside the house has never been able to make the order afraid by threatening it with force, because force operates on a timescale the order does not share. You cannot intimidate something that is willing to wait out your entire dynasty. You cannot frighten a servant of the many-faced God with the threat of death. For the same reason, you cannot frighten a fisherman with the threat of water. You cannot make an order built on impermanence feel insecure about your displeasure, because it does not expect your pleasure to outlast the next turning of the wheel. The iron coin carries this patience inside it as surely as it carries its theology. When it passes from hand to hand, it carries with it the quiet assurance of something that has already survived everything the world has tried to use against it, and that will be here after the latest crisis has resolved itself one way or another, and that does not need the current arrangement to hold in order to continue doing what it does. The many-faced God waits, his servants have learned to wait with him. And in a world full of things that burn themselves out with urgency, that particular quality, the willingness to simply endure, may be the most formidable weapon the Order possesses. The Faceless Men have been present in the world for a very long time, longer than most institutions that still function, longer than most of the kingdoms whose names fill the histories and whose ruins fill the landscape. They were there before Braavos was a city. They were there in their beginning, before the doom was even a possibility that the Dragon Lords had thought to worry about. What sustains them is not secrecy exactly. Many secret organizations have formed and dissolved over the centuries. Secrecy is a shield, not a foundation. What sustains the Faceless Men is the thing their theology is built around, the one constant that has never yet failed to be true. Everyone dies. Everything that begins also ends. The God they serve is the only God who has never failed to collect what he is owed. The many-faced God does not need armies or temples or the patronage of kings. He has time, and time is the one resource that always runs out for everyone except the thing that waits on the other side of it. The Order reflects this. They do not seek power in the ordinary sense, the kind that is measured in banners and gold and the loyalty of armed men. They have never tried to rule a city or a kingdom. They have never put a puppet on a throne. They work at the edges of power, in the space between the decisions that are made in public and the consequences of those decisions. They are the reminder that every human arrangement is temporary, and that the powerful are powerful only until they are not. In the long history of the world, this has been a remarkably durable position to occupy. The God they serve is not kind. The Order does not pretend he is. Kindness is a quality of people who care about particular outcomes. Death does not care. It arrives for the cruel and the gentle alike, for the deserving and the innocent, for those who prayed and those who scoffed. The Faceless Men, in accepting this as the fundamental truth of existence rather than the terrible exception, have made their peace with it in a way that most of the world has not. There is something in this worth sitting with, not imitating, not celebrating, but sitting with, the way you sit with a truth that is uncomfortable and refuses to leave. We build things to last, houses and families and faiths and kingdoms. We carve our names into stone. We tell our children stories about who we were so that something of us survives the body. We fight, sometimes viciously, for the continuation of the things we love. And the many-faced God waits, the way he has always waited, patient and unremarkable, and not particularly interested in whether we have made our peace with him or not. The Faceless Men chose to look at this directly. They chose to build their lives around the looking. Whether this makes them wise or simply very good at something terrible, the world has never quite been able to decide. But the candle in the house of black and white is still burning. The door is neither black nor white. And somewhere in a city built on water, in a building that does not announce itself, a face is being placed on a wall where it will wait, patient as its God, until it is needed. No one tends it, no one at all.